Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. My diabetic son called me crying. My phone lit up with his name over and over, but I did not see it until the meeting ended. When I finally called back, his voice was shaking so hard he could barely form words. My name is Malcolm. I am 34 years old, and I am a software engineer living just outside Chicago. My 9-year-old son, Khalil, has type 1 diabetes. When Khalil finally managed to speak, he told me that my wife had taken his insulin pump away because he did not do his chores. She told him he could have it back after dinner. His continuous glucose monitor was beeping that his blood sugar was climbing higher and higher. I felt something in me snap. I told him, "Stay right there. I'm coming home." I hung up, dialed 911, reported child endangerment, then tore out of the parking lot at a speed I knew could get me pulled over. The police and an ambulance met me at the house, and everything that followed changed our lives. When I tell this story, I keep coming back to the same thought. This did not start as something huge and obvious. It did not begin with sirens and handcuffs. It began years earlier with small choices, little dismissals, comments that I brushed off because I wanted to believe they were just stress talking. I wanted to believe that my family was solid, that my wife and I were on the same side, that we were both doing our best for Khalil. For a long time, that belief blinded me to how bad things were becoming. Khalil was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 6 years old. I remember that week like it was branded into my brain. I remember his tiny hands gripping my fingers in the pediatric intensive care unit, the smell of antiseptic, the beeping monitors, the way he tried to be brave even though he was terrified. The doctors explained that his pancreas no longer produced insulin, that he would depend on insulin for the rest of his life, that it was not something he could grow out of or fix with diet alone. They talked about blood sugar ranges, insulin dosing, ketones, and long-term complications. I nodded and took notes and pretended I understood, but inside I felt like I was drowning. Those early months were brutal. We had to learn how to count every gram of carbohydrate Khalil ate, how to calculate how much insulin to give him, how to interpret his continuous glucose monitor readings. We had to prick his finger in the middle of the night to make sure his levels did not drop too low while he slept. We had to be ready with fast-acting sugar if he went low and with insulin if he went high. Every snack, every meal, every sports practice, every birthday party was a calculation. For 3 years now, our lives have been measured in test strips, infusion sets, pump alarms, and a steady line on a glucose graph that means he is safe. My wife's name is Tanisha. She is 32, and we have been married for 11 years. When we first met in Atlanta, she was warm and patient, quick to laugh, the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday and turned ordinary dinners into small celebrations. When Khalil was born, she was gentle with him, singing to him while she changed his diapers, staying up late to rock him when he had colic. At the beginning, during those first months after his diagnosis, she went to every training session at the hospital, took notes, asked questions. She cried in the car afterward, and I held her hand and told her we would figure it out together. The change did not happen all at once. It was slow, gradual, like watching paint fade on a wall. At first it was small comments. When the alarm on Khalil's continuous glucose monitor went off at 2 in the morning, I would jump out of bed and go check his levels, tired but focused. Tanisha would roll over and sigh, saying things like, "He needs to learn to handle it himself," or "You cannot baby him forever." I would remind her that he was 6 years old, that he could not manage insulin dosing alone, that the stakes were literally life and death. She would argue that I was overprotective, that I was turning him into someone who expected special treatment. We would fight, our whispered arguments spilling out into the hallway while Khalil slept. I would tell her, "This is not about spoiling him. This is about keeping him alive." She would say, "You do not appreciate how hard this is for me. I'm tired too. I never get a break." Then, the next day, she would apologize. She would make Khalil pancakes weighed and measured on the food scale, hug him, and tell me she was just tired, that she loved him, that she knew his diabetes was serious. For a while after those apologies, things would be calm again. I clung to those calm moments and told myself that the arguments were just rough patches. Over time, though, Tanisha began to use Khalil's condition in ways that made my stomach knot. It started with small punishments connected to food. If he forgot to clean his room, she would announce that he could not have dessert. At first I told myself it was normal parenting. Lots of parents use dessert as a reward or consequence. But then the consequences shifted. On days when his blood sugar was dropping and he needed a snack to prevent a low, she would make him wait. If he talked back, she would say, "You can have your snack in 30 minutes. You need to learn to listen." Khalil would sit on the couch, pale and shaky, his monitor warning of a downward trend, and she would fold laundry or stay at her phone like it was no big deal. When I discovered those delayed snacks, I lost control. I stood in the kitchen with the open refrigerator humming behind me and said, "You do not withhold food from a diabetic child. You do not turn his medical needs into a lesson." Tanisha's eyes would fill with tears, and she would tell me I did not understand how hard it was to parent a child with special needs, how she felt judged by other people, how I did not appreciate everything she did. The guilt would wash over me. I would back down every time and tell myself she was just overwhelmed, that she would learn, that this would be the last time. It was never the last time. About 2 months before the day, I called 911. Khalil came to me while I was fixing dinner. He moved quietly, in that way he has when he does not want to make anyone angry. He said, "Dad, if I get an A on my math test, Mom said she will let me have my pump back." I froze with a knife halfway, through slicing a tomato. I said, "What do you mean, let you have it back?" He answered in a small voice, "She took it off this morning because I did not make my bed. She said I could wear it to school if I promised to be better." He looked at me with this mixture of confusion and shame, like he thought he had done something terrible. I saw red. I walked straight into the kitchen, where Tanisha was scrolling through her phone at the counter. I said, "What were you thinking taking his pump?" She looked up, annoyed, and said, "He needs to learn responsibility." I cannot believe what I was hearing. I said, "He is 9 years old with a disease that can kill him in a matter of hours without insulin." She shrugged and said I was being dramatic, that the school nurse had insulin, that he would be fine, that I constantly undermined her parenting. I felt like I was arguing with someone who lived on a different planet. I told her, "If you ever touch his medical equipment again, if you ever take that pump off him as punishment, I will leave." I'm not joking. She stared at me for a long moment, searching my face, and then said, "You would break up our family over this?" I said, "I will do whatever it takes to keep Khalil safe." She did not respond. She put down her phone, walked past me, and went upstairs. I stood there in the kitchen, breathing hard, trying to convince myself that the silence meant she understood, that this fight had finally cut through to her. I wanted to believe that threat would be enough to make her stop. I was wrong. On the day everything came to a head, I was at work downtown, giving a big presentation to a new client. I had put my phone on silent and turned it face down so I would not be distracted. The meeting ran long, and I was proud of how well it went. The moment I stepped out of the conference room, I picked up my phone and saw 7 missed calls from Khalil's number. It felt like the floor dropped out from under me. My heartbeat sped up so fast I could hear it in my ears. My first thought was that something had gone wrong with his blood sugar at school. I called him back immediately. He answered on the first ring, and I could hear him crying so hard that his breath hitched. He said, "Dad, please come home. I cannot find my pump. Mom took it. She will not give it back. My sugar is getting high. The monitor keeps beeping." I did not feel good. His voice was thin and shaky, and every word stabbed through me. I forced myself to stay calm enough to get details. I asked where his mother was. He said, "She is here, but she will not listen." I could hear muffled voices in the background, one high and desperate, one low and unbothered. I asked Khalil to hand the phone to his mother. When she picked up, she said, "Hello," in a tone that made it sound like I was interrupting a casual afternoon. I said, "What's going on?" She answered, "Khalil did not do his chores after school. His backpack was on the floor. His shoes were not put away. So I took his pump. He can have it back after he eats dinner and cleans up properly." I checked the time. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She calmly added, "Dinner is at 6 o'clock. He will be fine." I said, "Give him the pump right now." She replied, "No. You always let him get away with everything. He needs structure. He needs consequences." I said, "Tanisha, he is diabetic. This is not a video game you can pause. His blood sugar is rising." She answered, "I know that. You act like I do not know my own son's condition. He is not going to die in 2 hours. Stop being dramatic." There was this cold certainty in her voice, like she was absolutely sure that she was right. I realized then that I could not argue her into recognizing the danger. I hung up. My hand was shaking as I hit 911. When the operator answered, I said, "My wife has taken my 9-year-old son's insulin pump away as punishment and is refusing to give it back. He has type 1 diabetes. His continuous glucose monitor is reading high, and he has no access to insulin." The operator asked, "Is he conscious?" I said, "Yes, but he is scared and does not feel well." She asked if this was an emergency, and something in me snapped. I said, "Yes, this is an emergency. My son has type 1 diabetes and no insulin." She told me that police and an ambulance were on the way and asked me to stay on the line. I said, "I cannot. I have to drive home. I am about 20 minutes away." She tried to insist, but I ended the call. My son needed me moving, not standing in a hallway repeating the same details. I raced to the parking garage, barely remembering to grab my laptop. I drove out of the city, going 80 miles per hour in a 45-mile-per-hour zone, but I honestly did not care about speed limits. I called Khalil back through the car's hands-free system. When he answered, he sounded even more frightened. I said, "Buddy, I am on my way. The police and the ambulance are coming too. You are not alone. You are going to be okay." He said, "Dad, I feel shaky and tired." I could hear the alarm from his continuous glucose monitor in the background, a piercing sound that made my chest tighten. I knew I needed to keep him talking and alert. I asked him about his day at school, about the science project he had been excited about the video game he had been saving up to buy with his allowance. Between sniffles, he told me about his friend who had traded him a rare card at recess, about how his teacher had praised his reading. His voice kept drifting, getting quieter, and every time that happened, I would say his name sharply, bring him back, ask another question. I did not tell him how terrified I was. I did not tell him my hand were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers were going numb. When I turned onto our street, I saw the flashing lights before I even saw my driveway. 2 police cars and an ambulance were parked outside my house, their lights painting the front of the house red and blue. I pulled in behind them and jumped out before the car had fully stopped. I ran up the front steps and threw the door open. Khalil was on the couch in the living room, pale, sweating, and trembling. His continuous glucose monitor, attached to his arm, showed a number that made my stomach drop, 310 and climbing. His insulin pump was not on his body. The paramedics came in right behind me, moving with that practiced speed that is somehow both controlled and urgent. One of them, a tall man with a calm voice, knelt beside Khalil and started asking questions. "Hey, young man, what is your name? How are you feeling? When did you last have insulin?" Khalil's answers were disjointed. He said, "My mom took my pump. My stomach hurts. I feel weird." I knelt on his other side, brushing the damp hair off his forehead, trying to be steady for him. One of the officers, a woman with her hair pulled back into a tight bun, looked around the room and asked, "Where is his mother?" Tanisha stood in the kitchen doorway, her arms crossed. She looked more annoyed than scared. She said, "What is all this? Why did you call the police?" I turned on her and said, "You took a diabetic child's insulin pump. That is child endangerment." She rolled her eyes slightly and said, "This is ridiculous. He is my son. I was teaching him a lesson. You completely overreacted." The female officer addressed Tanisha directly. She said, "Ma'am, did you remove your son's insulin pump?" Tanisha said, "Yes, but he was only going to be without it for 2.5 hours. He was not going to die. You all are acting like I tried to murder him." The officer's expression hardened. She asked, "Where's the pump now?" Tanisha said, "In my purse," in a tone that suggested this whole situation was a nuisance. The officer said, more firmly, "Ma'am, please retrieve the insulin pump now." Tanisha hesitated, then added, "You are treating me like a criminal. I am his mother." The officer repeated, "Retrieve it. Now." Tanisha finally walked over to the hook where her purse hung, dug through it, and pulled out Khalil's insulin pump. She handed it to the paramedic with a little flick of her wrist, as if this were all beneath her. The paramedic took it without comment and quickly reattached it to Khalil, checking connections and priming the line. Another paramedic started an intravenous line, just in case they needed to give fluids quickly. While they worked, the first paramedic looked up at Tanisha and said, You took a type 1 diabetic child's insulin pump away for over an hour as punishment. His tone was not angry, but it carried a weight that made the room feel smaller. Tanisha said, "He needs to learn consequences. He is always so careless. You do not live with him. You do not understand." The paramedic replied, "Ma'am, this child could have gone into diabetic ketoacidosis. That is a life-threatening medical emergency." She waved her hand and said, "But he did not. He is fine. Look, he is sitting right there." The paramedic looked at me, then back at her, and shook his head slightly. One of the officers turned to me and asked, "Do you want to press charges?" I looked at Khalil, who was still shaking and pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. His small hand clutched mine like I was the only solid thing in the world. I thought about all the times I had told myself it would not happen again. I thought about the threats I had made and then backed away from. I heard Tanisha say, "You are not really considering that. Tell them no. This is just parenting." I swallowed hard and said, "Yes. I absolutely want to press charges." Tanisha's face drained of color. "You are going to have me arrested? Over parenting." I said, "This is not parenting. This is abuse. You withheld life-saving medical equipment from our child." She started to cry, but even then, there was this edge to it, like she was more offended than remorseful. She said to the officers, "He is vindictive. We have been having marital problems. He is using this to get rid of me." The officer who had spoken to her earlier said, "Ma'am, this is not about your marriage. This is about your son's safety. You need to come with us." Tanisha said, "I am not going anywhere. This is my house, my son." The officer said, "Ma'am, you are under arrest for child endangerment," and began to read her rights. As the words of the Miranda warning filled the room, Tanisha stared at me as if I had betrayed her. She said, "I cannot believe you're doing this. Khalil needs his mother." I said quietly, "Khalil needs someone who will not risk his life to win an argument." She screamed, calling me every insult she could think of, her voice echoing off the walls. The officers led her out in handcuffs while the neighbors watched from their porches, curious and stunned. I did not feel triumph or satisfaction. I felt tired and sick and shaken, but I also felt something else, a steady, cold certainty that this was necessary. The paramedics transported Khalil to the closest children's hospital in Chicago for observation. I rode in the front of the ambulance, listening to the soft beeps and murmured updates from the back. At the hospital, they checked his labs and monitored him for several hours. His blood sugar had been high, but had not yet crossed into full diabetic ketoacidosis. The pediatric emergency room doctor, a woman with calm eyes and a no-nonsense tone, told me, "Another hour and we might be having a very different conversation." She asked what had happened, and I told her everything. The doctor took notes, her pen moving steadily across the chart. When I finished, she said, "I am obligated to report this. You understand that?" I nodded. "Good," I said. "Please report it. It needs to be documented." I sat beside Khalil's hospital bed while he dozed, exhausted from the adrenaline crash. His small body looked even smaller in that big hospital bed. I kept adjusting his blanket, checking his pump, looking at the monitor that displayed his glucose readings, even though the nurses were already doing the same. I could not stop watching. A representative from Child Protective Services arrived that evening. Her name was Denise Miller. She was in her mid-40s, with a pressed blouse, a notebook, and a voice that walked the line between gentle and firm. She pulled up a chair beside Khalil's bed and introduced herself to him first. She said, "Hi, Khalil. My name is Ms. Miller. I am here to make sure you are safe. Can I ask you a few questions?" He looked at me. I nodded and squeezed his hand. He looked back at her and said, "Okay." Denise asked him if anything like this had happened before. At first he hesitated. He looked at his hands, twisting his fingers together. Then he started talking. He told her about the times his mother delayed his snacks when his blood sugar was low. He told her about the times she called him dramatic when he said he felt sick. He told her about the day she took his pump because he did not make his bed, how he had to promise to do better before she would let him wear it to school. His voice was small but steady. Each sentence felt like another weight dropping onto a scale. Denise wrote everything down carefully. When she finished speaking with Khalil, she asked me to step into a small family conference room down the hall. She asked why I had not reported any of this earlier. I told her the truth. I said, "I thought I could handle it." I thought I could protect him by being there, by watching, by talking to her. I told myself she was just stressed, that she would stop. I did not want to break up our family. Denise looked at me for a long moment, and then said, "You did not break up your family. Your wife did when she decided to use your son's medical condition as a weapon. You are doing the right thing now." Denise told me that Khalil could not go home if Tanisha was there. I said, "She is in jail tonight." Denise said, "She will probably bond out by morning. Until the court sorts this out, Khalil needs to be in a safe environment." I said, "He will be with me. I will make sure of it." She explained that Child Protective Services would be conducting home visits, monitoring the situation, reviewing hospital records, and speaking with Khalil's doctors and school staff. I agreed to everything. I would have agreed to a camera crew in my living room if it meant keeping Khalil safe. Tanisha bonded out of jail around midnight. Her sister paid the bond. My phone started ringing over and over again as I sat in the hospital room, the glow of the monitor reflecting off the walls. I did not answer. The voicemail notifications stacked up. Later, when Khalil was asleep, I stepped into the hallway and listened to them with my headphones on. In some, Tanisha was sobbing, begging me to come get her, saying she was sorry. In others, she was enraged, screaming that I had ruined everything, that Child Protective Services was going to take Khalil away because of me, that this was all my fault for overreacting. I saved every message and forwarded them to an email account so I could send them to a lawyer. The next morning, after Khalil was discharged, I checked us into a hotel near the hospital instead of going home. I did not want him walking back into a house that still smelled like yesterday's panic. I met with a family law attorney that afternoon in an office downtown. I played the voicemails for him, described what had happened, told him about the history of delayed snacks and taken pumps. He listened quietly, taking notes. When I finished, he said, "This is one of the clearest cases of medical neglect I have ever seen. We are going to file for divorce and emergency full custody." Hearing the words divorce and full custody felt surreal, like they belonged to someone else's life, but I nodded and signed the paperwork. An emergency custody hearing was scheduled for the following week. Until then, Khalil and I stayed in that hotel. He did not want to go home, and I did not push it. We made a routine out of it. In the mornings, we would get breakfast downstairs, and I would measure out his food on a small portable scale while he watched cartoons on the muted television. In the afternoons, I worked remotely from the small desk by the window while he played on his tablet or read his comics on the bed. At night, we would swim in the hotel pool if his blood sugar was steady, or we would build elaborate cities out of paper cups and napkins if it was not. Even in that little bubble, the fear did not leave him. Twice he woke up crying from nightmares, shaking and sweaty, begging me not to let anyone take his pump. The first time it happened, he clutched the pump with both hands as if it might vanish. I sat on the bed beside him, held him, and said, "No one is going to take this from you again. Not for chores, not for anything. Your medical equipment is not a punishment. Your health comes first." He whispered, "Will she come here?" I said no. She is not allowed to. The court and Child Protective Services will make sure of that. The custody hearing was brutal. We sat in a family courtroom in Chicago, surrounded by other families whose lives were also being dissected. Tanisha walked in with her lawyer, wearing a neat dress and a carefully arranged expression of fragile sadness. When she glanced at me, her eyes were full of accusation. The judge, a man with gray hair and tired eyes, called the case. Tanisha's lawyer argued first, saying that every parent makes mistakes, that my wife had simply misjudged the severity of the situation, that I had overreacted by calling the police, that I was trying to alienate Khalil from his mother. Tanisha cried on the stand. She said she loved her son, that she would never hurt him on purpose, that she just wanted him to be more responsible. She said I always undermined her, that I treated her like she was stupid, that I was using this incident to punish her for unrelated arguments. She looked at the judge and said, "I took his pump for a short time. He was never in real danger. The ambulance got there, and he was fine. This has all been blown out of proportion." My lawyer then played the voicemails Tanisha had left. The courtroom grew very quiet as her voice filled the space, swinging back and forth between wailing apologies and furious accusations. They played the 911 recording where I was begging the operator to send help because my son had no access to insulin. They played the recording of Khalil's call from my phone records, his small voice crying, "Dad, I do not feel good. Mom will not give me my pump." Even the court reporter paused and looked up at one point. After the recordings, the paramedic who had responded that day took the stand. My lawyer asked him to describe Khalil's condition when they arrived. He said, "The child was pale and sweating, visibly shaking, and reported feeling weak and unwell. His continuous glucose monitor reading was over 300 and rising. Based on his history of type 1 diabetes and the absence of insulin delivery, he was at risk of progressing to diabetic ketoacidosis." He explained what diabetic ketoacidosis is: a condition where, without insulin, the body starts breaking down fat for fuel, producing ketones that turn the blood acidic, leading to organ failure, coma, and death if untreated. The paramedic was asked if this was a medical emergency. He said yes, absolutely. There is no scenario in which deliberately withholding insulin from a child with type 1 diabetes is safe for any period of time. None. Tanisha's lawyer tried to suggest that because Khalil had not actually developed diabetic ketoacidosis, the danger was exaggerated. The paramedic responded, "Our intervention prevented him from getting worse. That does not mean the risk was not real." His calm, clinical tone made his words hit even harder. The emergency room doctor from the hospital took the stand next. She repeated what she had told me that night, but this time under oath. She said, "Another hour without insulin, and this child would most likely have begun to show clear signs of diabetic ketoacidosis. His lab results already indicated he was headed in that direction." She talked about the progression of symptoms, about how children can compensate for a while and then suddenly crash. She emphasized that this was not a one-time accident where a parent forgot a dose amid chaos, but an intentional removal of medical equipment. Denise from Child Protective Services testified as well. She described what Khalil had told her about previous incidents, about delayed snacks, and earlier times when the pump had been used as leverage. She said, "This is not a parent making a single mistake. This is a pattern of using a child's medical condition as a tool for discipline and control." She explained the emotional impact that can have on a child, the way it teaches them that their basic safety is negotiable. Finally, the judge addressed Tanisha directly. He said, "Ma'am, do you understand that type 1 diabetes is a life-threatening condition?" Tanisha wiped her eyes and said, "Yes, I do." The judge said, "Then explain to me why you believed it was appropriate to withhold insulin from your son." She said, "I just wanted him to learn responsibility. I did not think 2 hours would hurt him. I thought the nurse at school would have insulin if he needed it. I did not think it was that serious." Her words hung in the air like smoke. The judge sighed, the sound loud in the quiet room. He said, "That is the recurring theme here. You did not think. You did not think about your son's safety. You did not think about the medical consequences. You thought about your need to be obeyed. You placed your desire for control above his need to live." He paused, then continued, "I have been on this bench for 23 years. I have seen parents make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones. But mistakes are usually accidental. This was deliberate. You deliberately removed life-saving medical equipment from a child. You deliberately ignored his pleas. You deliberately allowed his blood sugar to rise. And when confronted, you showed no genuine remorse. You blamed everyone else." The judge granted me full legal and physical custody. He ruled that Tanisha would be allowed supervised visitation once a week with a court-appointed supervisor, pending the outcome of the criminal case. If she was convicted, visitation could be reduced or revoked entirely. He ordered her to attend parenting classes and therapy and told her that any violation of the terms, including violating the restraining order he put in place, would result in her losing visitation permanently. Tanisha began sobbing, saying, "Please do not take my son from me." The judge replied, "You did this to yourself. This hearing is adjourned." That day, Khalil and I went back to our house. Walking through the front door felt strange, like entering a place that had been rearranged by an invisible hand. I packed up Tanisha's things, her clothes, her shoes, her books, the framed photos from her side of the dresser, and boxed them up. Her sister came by to pick them up, staying on the sidewalk because of the restraining order. She did not say much to me, just, "He is my nephew. I hope you keep him safe," before loading the boxes in her trunk and driving away. The The restraining order barred Tanisha from coming within 500 feet of our home, Khalil's school, or the hospital where he receives his diabetes care. She attempted to violate the order twice within the first month, showing up near our street, and once at the edge of the school parking lot. Both times, school staff or neighbors called the police. Both times, she was arrested and released on bond. Her criminal lawyer eventually convinced her to stop trying to approach us, at least for a while. The criminal trial for child endangerment took 3 months to come to court. During that time, Khalil and I settled into a new version of normal. I took a short leave from work and then shifted to a more flexible schedule so I could be there for him before and after school. I met with his teachers to explain what had happened and made sure every staff member who might interact with him understood his diabetes management plan. I made lists and backup lists, stocked the nurse's office with extra supplies, and kept a bag of emergency snacks in every place we spent time. At the criminal trial, Tanisha pleaded not guilty. She sat at the defense table in a dark blazer, her hair pulled back neatly, looking smaller somehow. The prosecutor laid out the case step by step, from the missed calls on my phone to the paramedics' arrival, the hospital stay, and the prior pattern of behavior. They called expert witnesses, including a pediatric endocrinologist with 3 decades of experience treating children with type 1 diabetes and a diabetes educator who works with families learning to manage the condition. The pediatric endocrinologist walked the jury through what happens inside the body of a child with type 1 diabetes who is deprived of insulin. He explained that without insulin, glucose cannot enter the cells to be used for energy, so it builds up in the blood. The body, starved for usable fuel, begins breaking down fat instead, producing ketones. He described how ketones are acidic, how they build up in the bloodstream, how that acid load starts to impair organ function. He talked about the progression: nausea, vomiting, rapid breathing, abdominal pain, confusion, and eventually coma and death if treatment does not arrive in time. The prosecutor asked him how long a child like Khalil, given his age, weight, and typical insulin needs, could safely go without insulin. The doctor had reviewed Khalil's medical records. He said, based on this child's profile and the blood glucose reading of over 300 at the time of emergency services arrival, I estimate that he had perhaps 2 more hours before clearly entering diabetic ketoacidosis, maybe 3 at the outside if he was fortunate. Once that process begins, the risk of severe complications increases rapidly. The prosecutor then asked what would likely have happened if Khalil had gone into diabetic ketoacidosis at home with a caregiver who was still refusing to give him his insulin pump. The doctor hesitated for a moment, then said, without immediate medical intervention, a child in diabetic ketoacidosis will deteriorate. If the caregiver continues to deny the severity of the situation and does not seek help, the child can die. It is as simple and as devastating as that. Tanisha's lawyer objected, calling it speculation, but the judge overruled, allowing the doctor to finish explaining the medical realities. The defense attorney tried to narrow the doctor's statement, asking, "Can you say with 100% certainty that this child would have died?" The endocrinologist replied, "I can say with 100% certainty that withholding insulin created a life-threatening situation. I can say with 100% certainty that a child with type 1 diabetes, deprived of insulin for that length of time, will move toward diabetic ketoacidosis. The exact outcome in any individual case depends on multiple variables, but the risk to his life was not hypothetical." The diabetes educator testified about her work with families. She said that she spends countless hours teaching parents to never, under any circumstances, use insulin dosing or access to medical equipment as a form of discipline. She explained how critical it is for children with diabetes to feel secure that their basic medical needs will always be met, regardless of behavior. She said, when a child learns that their access to insulin can be taken away as punishment, it can create long-term anxiety, mistrust, and trauma, on top of the physical risks. When it was Tanisha's turn to testify, she said again that she never meant to harm Khalil. She said she was overwhelmed, that she felt judged by other parents, that she was tired of feeling like the bad guy at home. She insisted that she believed the school nurse and emergency services were safety nets that made the situation less serious. She cried and said, "I just wanted him to listen. I did not think he could really die from missing insulin for a little while." The prosecutor asked, even after doctors and nurses taught you about the dangers. She hesitated and said, I thought they were exaggerating to scare us into doing everything perfectly. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. I sat in the hallway outside the courtroom, staring at the floor, while Khalil stayed with my sister at home. When the jury filed back in, my heart pounded so loudly I barely heard the foreperson say the words, guilty of child endangerment. The judge sentenced Tanisha to 2 years of probation, mandatory parenting classes, and ongoing therapy. She lost all custody rights and was barred from unsupervised contact with Khalil. The sentence felt both heavy and strangely light compared to what could have happened if the paramedics had arrived later. Khalil was relieved when I told him she would not be able to take him anywhere or make decisions about his medical care. He listened quietly and then asked, So she cannot take my pump again? I said no. She cannot take your pump again. He nodded and said, Good, and then went back to his homework, but I could see the tension easing from his shoulders. Children measure safety in very concrete things. For him, the simplest measure was that his pump would stay on his body. 6 months into her probation, Tanisha violated it by trying to pick Khalil up from school. She showed up at dismissal time, calling his name from the sidewalk. The staff knew about the court orders and immediately took him back inside, then called the police. She was arrested and spent 90 days in jail. After her release, she disappeared from our immediate orbit, staying away physically even as she remained a presence through letters and reports from her probation officer. Her probation is scheduled to end in about 10 months. In the months since, Khalil and I have built a new life. We have routines that give him structure and reassure him that he is safe. Every night before he goes to bed, we check his insulin pump together, making sure the infusion site is secure, the reservoir has enough insulin, and the battery is charged. We look at the trend graph on his continuous glucose monitor and talk about what might have caused any highs or lows that day. I keep emergency sugar tablets in my car, in his backpack, in the kitchen, and even tucked in the pocket of the jacket he wears to school in winter. Khalil goes to therapy twice a week with a child psychologist who specializes in medical trauma. At first, he would sit in the office, curled up in one of the big armchairs, barely speaking. Now he talks more. He draws pictures of houses with thick walls and big locks where he says the bad rules cannot get in. He plays out scenes with toy figures where one figure takes something important away from another, and the second figure gets it back with the help of a third. Sometimes when he comes out of session, he is quiet and thoughtful. Other times he is lighter, joking, asking if we can stop for ice cream. The therapist tells me that Khalil is resilient, that with time and consistency he can heal. She also says that what happened to him is not something children simply forget. It becomes part of their story. She says, your job is to make sure the rest of his story is different from the beginning of it. I take that seriously. I sit in the waiting room during his sessions, flipping through old magazines without really seeing them, thinking about all the ways I need to stay vigilant. Tanisha sends letters occasionally. They arrive in plain envelopes, written in her familiar handwriting. I open them alone and read them before deciding what to do. They almost all say the same things. I am sorry. I made a mistake. I love you. I miss you. Please forgive me. Sometimes she slips in a blaming language, writing, your father turned you against me, or we could have been a family if he had not called the police. I do not show those letters to Khalil. The therapist says he is not ready, and he may never be. She says the choice to read them or not should be his when he is older. For now, I keep them in a folder in a locked drawer. People sometimes ask how I did not see this coming. They ask how I stayed with someone who could do something like that to her own child. I do not have a simple answer. The truth is that the cruelty did not arrive wearing a sign. It came dressed up as discipline and structure and tough love. It started as small boundary pushes that, over time, became boundary crossings. Each time, I told myself it would not go further. Each time, I believed her apologies. I thought I could protect Khalil by staying, by watching closely, by stepping in when needed. I thought keeping our family intact was part of protecting him. I was wrong. I should have left the first time she delayed his snack while his blood sugar was dropping. I should have documented everything and gone to court then. Instead, I tried to fix it from the inside. I argued. I reasoned. I explained. I brought home pamphlets from the endocrinologist, highlighted sections about the dangers of withholding insulin or food. I thought if I just found the right words, the right angle, she would understand. But you cannot reason someone out of a belief that their need for control is more important than a child's safety. A few months after the trial, I started attending a support group for parents of children with chronic illnesses at a community center on the south side of Chicago. We meet once a week in a circle of folding chairs, with coffee that is always a little too strong and cookies that taste like they have been sitting on the plate for hours. Parents there talk about feeding tubes, seizures, asthma attacks, and yes, diabetes. One night, I told a condensed version of my story. There was a long silence when I finished. Then another father, whose daughter has a heart condition, said, "You did what you had to do." A lot of people would not have had the courage to call. It did not erase my guilt, but it helped me carry it. I have started to date again, cautiously. Nothing serious yet. There is a woman named Serena who teaches at Khalil's school. We met at a parent-teacher conference, then ran into each other again at a school fundraiser. She is patient and kind, with a quick, dry sense of humor. One afternoon, we were talking near the playground, watching Khalil and some other kids chase each other around. She noticed his pump tubing peek out from under his shirt. She said softly, "He has type 1 diabetes, right?" I nodded and explained the basics out of habit. She listened, then said, "That must be a lot to manage." I said, "It is not hard when you care more about your child's life than about being right." She looked at me for a long moment and then said, "That should be the baseline for parenting." I said, "You would think so." Khalil's diabetes doctor recently told us that his hemoglobin A1C, the measure of his average blood sugar over the past few months, is the best it has been since his diagnosis. We sat in the exam room while the doctor scrolled through the graphs from his pump and monitor. He said, "Whatever you are doing at home is working. His numbers are more stable. He is growing well. This is what we like to see." I said, "We just follow the medical plan and do not use his health as a bargaining chip." The doctor nodded slowly and said, "You would be surprised how many parents do not manage that." I was not surprised anymore. Tanisha's probation will end in about 10 months. My lawyer says she will probably petition the court for some form of visitation afterward. He also says no judge is likely to grant it without a lot of evidence that she has changed, consistent therapy, compliance with all court orders, a demonstration that she understands exactly what she did and why it was wrong. Her criminal record and her violation of probation will weigh heavily against her. For now, there is nothing for us to do but live our lives and respond if and when a petition appears in the mail. Recently, Khalil asked me why his mother did what she did. It was a quiet evening, the kind that creeps up on you. We had finished dinner, his blood sugar was in range, and we were sitting on the couch watching a movie. I thought he was focused on the screen, but during a lull in the action he muted the television and said, "Dad, why did Mom care more about my backpack on the floor than whether I got my insulin?" The question hit me harder than anything a judge or a lawyer had said. I took a deep breath. I did not want to lie, but I also did not want to drown him in adult explanations. I said, "Sometimes people get so focused on being in control that they forget what really matters. For your mom, the rules about chores and how the house looked became more important to her than they should have. She let her anger and her need to be obeyed get bigger than her love in that moment. That does not make sense. It was wrong, but it says more about her than it does about you." He frowned and said, "That is dumb." I said, "Yes, it is. Completely." He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "If she asked to see me one day, do I have to go?" I said, "No. You get to decide. When you are older, if you want to talk to her or read her letters, I will support you. If you never want to, I will support you. My job is to keep you safe and to listen to what you need." He nodded slowly and unmuted the movie, leaning against my side. I wrapped an arm around him and felt the small, constant weight of his palm between us, a reminder of everything that had happened and everything that still needed to be protected. Some nights, after Khalil is asleep and the house is quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional beep from his monitor, I sit at the kitchen table and replay that day in my mind. I remember the missed calls on my phone, his voice on the line saying he did not feel good, the way Tanisha dismissed my fear as dramatics, the flashing lights in front of our house, the sight of him pale and shaking on the couch. I remember the moment the officer asked if I wanted to press charges and the seconds that stretched out before I said yes. I have wondered if I overreacted, if calling 911 and pressing charges and filing for divorce was too extreme. That doubt creeps in at odd times, like when I fill out school forms that ask about his family situation, or when I see other couples at school events, standing together with their children. Then I hear Khalil's voice in my head, small and scared, saying, "Dad, I do not feel good. Mom will not give me my pump." I think about the pediatric endocrinologist explaining that he was a few hours away from a medical emergency that could have killed him. I think about the possibility that it could have been too late. When I hold those memories up against each other, the image of my son on that couch and the knowledge of what could have happened if I had done nothing, the doubt shrinks. I know I did the right thing. I will make the same call again every single time. My son's life is not a bargaining chip. His health is not a punishment. His insulin pump, his continuous glucose monitor, his insulin vials, his test strips, none of those are tools for discipline. They are the thin line between an ordinary day and disaster. The fact that I had to involve the police and child protective services to enforce something as basic as do not take life-saving medicine away from a child still feels unreal to me. The fact that I had to see my own wife led away in handcuffs to protect our son is something I never imagined when we stood in front of our families years ago and promised to take care of each other. But when I look at Khalil now, laughing with his friends, handling his pump with growing confidence, reading labels on food packages like a pro, talking to his doctor about his numbers as if they are a puzzle he can solve, I know what matters. What matters is that he is alive. He is safe. He will never again have to worry that someone he trusts will take his pump away to prove a point. He will grow up knowing that in this house, his health comes before chores, before discipline, before pride, before everything. He will know that when he says, "I do not feel right," I will listen. That is the promise I make to him every time I check his blood sugar in the middle of the night, every time I refill a prescription, every time I tell him, "You are not a burden. Your diabetes is not your fault. We handle it together." I do not feel like a perfect father. I do not feel like a hero. I feel like someone who should have acted sooner, who should have believed the warning signs the first time instead of the 10th. But I am trying. I am paying attention. I am learning to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, no matter how much I want to believe otherwise. I am learning that protecting my son sometimes means making choices that look drastic from the outside, but make perfect sense when you understand the stakes. This is the life we have now. Alarms and carb counts, clinic visits and therapy sessions, school projects and bedtime stories, quiet evenings and sudden blood sugar corrections. It is not the life I pictured when Khalil was born, but it is ours. My job is simple and impossibly big at the same time. Be better, be vigilant, be the parent he deserves, and make sure that no one ever uses his diabetes as a weapon against him again. Not his mother. Not anyone. Never again. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.